lovers, welcome to episode number 6 of Dive Stories, brought to you by PADI, helping millions around the world to seek adventure and save the ocean. I'm your host, Ocean Allison, and on today's episode, I'm chatting with Dr. Jessica Meir. Jessica is a NASA astronaut and a marine biologist. During this episode, Jessica shares some truly incredible scientific diving stories from the poles to the tropics, all about the similarities and differences between scuba diving and spacewalks, and what it's like to look down on this blue planet we all call home. All that and more coming right up. Thanks for being here. You're listening to Dive Stories. We bring the underwater world to you through in-depth conversations with inspiring divers from around the globe. Thanks for diving in with us as we seek adventure and save the ocean. Happy listening and happy diving. Today's Dive Stories guest is NASA astronaut and marine biologist, Dr. Jessica Meir. Jessica, welcome to Dive Stories. Welcome back to Earth, and thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
All right. Thank you, Allison. It's wonderful to be speaking with you today.
Yeah, definitely. On a personal note, I'm really excited to have the opportunity to chat with you. I've been following along with your journey as an astronaut for several years now, pretty much in particular because of your background in marine science. And before I forget, I do also want to say a big thank you for being on the show on behalf of PADI's CEO, Drew Richardson, who I know, you guys have been actually diving together a few times.
Yes, we have. We've been on a few scientific diving expeditions together, one to the Antarctic and another to Belize. So always a pleasure to work with Drew, and he's become a good friend as well. So happy to be doing this.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Jessica, we're actually going to start this podcast out by diving right into what we call the Dive 5. And how the Dive 5 works is at the start of each episode, I ask our guest 5 rapid fire questions about their experience as a diver and an ocean lover. So are you ready to answer the Dive 5, Jessica?
I'm ready.
Okay. Number 1, where is the first place you ever took a breath underwater?
In Jamestown, in Rhode Island.
Okay, number 2, in one word, how would you describe diving in Antarctica?
Magical.
Number 3, how many days did you spend in outer space?
205.
Number 4, which part of the ocean stood out to you most when you were looking down at Earth from space?
The Amazon was particularly impressive. You can see all of the different colors as the water is mixing with the ocean water and see all those swirls, and it is truly beautiful.
So number 5, this is a big one. In just one word, what does the ocean mean to you?
Life.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for answering the Dive 5. We're going to get a little more in depth now by jumping into the core of this interview. And I want to start out by chatting with you about your personal connection to the ocean as a child growing up, because I've read that you started saying you wanted to be an astronaut at about 5 years old, and that this really was a childhood dream for you. But with that, though, I'm curious, what was your connection to the ocean like as a child? And growing up, did you have dreams of scuba diving or becoming a marine biologist?
Well, you're right. I did start saying I wanted to be an astronaut from the time that I was 5. And I did grow up in Maine. So most people associate that with the coast and lobster. But I actually grew up in northern Maine in Caribou, which is not near the coast. So unfortunately, I didn't grow up next to the ocean. I think, though, that I was always interested in it, just since the time I was a kid as well, I was really interested in biology and fascinated by the world around me, plants and animals. And for me, growing up, that was mostly trees and forests. But I think then that did just naturally extend to the ocean. And particularly when I was an undergraduate, I really wanted to get certified and get my scuba diving certification and explore a little bit further. So I think perhaps it was this common theme of exploration and always trying to go around the next corner or below the surface of the water or take that next step. So the ocean seemed to be the next place to go.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So you did, in fact, earn your PhD in marine biology from Scripps Institution of Oceanography in 2009. And your research focused on the diving physiology of animals in extreme environments, specifically emperor penguins in Antarctica and elephant seals in Northern California. So I'm curious, what drew you to study the diving abilities of these particular animals?
Well, I think I chose those specific species because for me, it was the right place to start with the extremes. So, if you're trying to get at underlying physiological adaptation, which I was really interested in just thinking about the remarkable diversity in behaviors in the animal kingdom. So, these animals that can dive so impressively, or high altitude animals, that kind of thing. I was always fascinated by that. And for me, it was the physiology. What is it about their bodies that makes them so unique and well adapted and able to do that, able to complete and be capable of those kind of behaviors? So it made sense to me to start with the best divers in any of those categories, because if you go to the extremes, that's probably where you're going to see the most extreme adaptation or the most pronounced or perhaps most easily observable adaptation, because the emperor penguin, for example, is the best diver in the avian world. So compared to any other bird, they can certainly dive far deeper, far longer, more than half an hour on a single breath, and to remarkable depths, far more than 500 meters. And an elephant seal, the best diver of any of the pinnipeds. So they're diving for 2 hours, more than 2 hours in some cases, on a single breath. And again, these are air-breathing, breath-hold divers, just like we are, but somehow they have that extraordinary capability, which of course we don't have at all as humans. So it just made sense to start studying those extreme animals to try to really understand the extent of those physiological adaptations.
Yeah, wow. Extraordinary animals to get to study, I imagine. Now, in order to conduct the emperor penguin research in particular that you did, you were trained as a scientific diver at Scripps, and then, like we touched on a little bit in the Dive 5, you actually went diving beneath the ice in Antarctica the several times that you've been on expedition there. So how do you think that scientific diving, specifically in Antarctica, gave you a unique edge when it came to being selected as a NASA astronaut?
Yeah, I'm glad that you keyed in on that because I think it actually was one of the things that made a difference for me and really stood out in my application. And I'll never forget that first dive in the Antarctic when you plunge down through the ice. And that first dive, you're there with the dive team, to do your checkout dive. And the place that we were doing the dive in McMurdo Sound, it was relatively close to McMurdo Station. So the sea ice there was really thick. The ice was 17 feet thick where I was going through that first dive hole. And I remember thinking, as you're going down through the hole, of course, it's all kind of slushy and very bad, low visibility when you're going down through the hole. And I thought, oh my goodness, is this what it's actually going to be like? This is terrible. And you're also kind of thinking, it's going to be so cold. Is this dry suit really going to do the trick? So all those things going through your head. And then as soon as I came out below that dive hole, I remember seeing this beautiful clarity. And, of course, in the Antarctic in the spring or coming closer to the summer, we have extraordinary visibility. So hundreds of feet of visibility. And the light comes through these cracks in the ice or through the holes with these shafts, kind of this like highway to heaven type scene. And then that's, of course, where you see all the color. you've gotten so used to this white, austere environment in the Antarctic, devoid of any color. And then suddenly, underneath the surface, that's where it all is. These bright red sea stars and big yellow sea spiders and big purple or white sponges. And then, of course, seals and penguins, depending on where you are. So much life down there. It is such a stark contrast to what is lacking on the surface in the Antarctic. So I'll never forget that. But I think it really did help me out with my application as an astronaut, particularly since I came into the program from the life science perspective. So one of the hallmarks about our job as astronauts is that we have to be operators. We are up there fixing things and doing all kinds of different tasks, ranging from doing scientific experiments to doing spacewalks, fixing the toilet, changing the light bulbs. So you really have to be someone who has that kind of operational experience, we call it. You're good at a diversity of tasks and you can fix things. You kind of understand that engineering context as well. So for a lot of people in our office, if they've come from a background of being, say, a military pilot, then the astronaut selection committee knows they probably have a lot of high operational aptitude because their jobs as a pilot, if they're successful in that realm, are really similar to that. They require that skill set. And then people from engineering backgrounds as well, again, usually have more of those inherent skills based on their everyday job. So for me, coming in as a life scientist, they needed to make sure that I wasn't just, some geeky lab scientist in the corner that was just kind of good at my specialized little niche of science. So the fact that I could demonstrate some of these operational type skills, like performing in extreme environments requiring technical hardware, like a dry suit, like the specialized diving equipment that we'll use in the Antarctic, diving in that overhead environment, even just living and working in the Antarctic in general, when you're not just always doing science, sometimes you're fixing a snowmobile or shoveling snow all day. So I think that skills like that helped the astronaut selection committee know that I did indeed possess those skills. So I think there really is a correlation as well in terms of technical diving capability, in terms of how we do things in space.
So to add to that, I do just want to go back a little bit. In 2002, actually, before you even started your PhD research, you had the opportunity to live underwater for 5 days straight in the Aquarius Underwater Laboratory, which is in Florida. And you did this as an aquanaut, not an astronaut, but an aquanaut for the 4th NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operation, which for listeners is commonly referred to as NEMO. And I think that pretty much every diver at some point has wished that they could live underwater, at least for a short period of time. I know that I definitely have. So I'd love if you could describe for myself and listeners a little bit about how Aquarius Reef Base works, and mostly, what was it like for you to live underwater?
Yeah, certainly. I have great memories from that NEMO mission. And to start, the reason why we use that as an environment for NASA astronaut training and also for technology and hardware tests and demonstrations is because it serves for us as a strong and solid analog environment. So what we mean by that is if we're trying to train people or we're trying to test hardware for something that's going to be utilized or sent to space, how do we do that on Earth? What we try to do is find environments that have some of those characteristics in common. So the underwater realm, as we already talked a little bit about, has a lot of commonalities in terms of the fact that you need a life support system to go outside. In the Aquarius habitat, you're living in a small confined space with a group of other people. You have a specific mission objective and tasks to accomplish, scientific experiments, hardware tests, that kind of thing, just like we do on space. So these environments, like the underwater environment and the NEMO missions, help us train and also test things. So when I was here, this was, as you mentioned, before I was an astronaut, and I was working at NASA Johnson Space Center as a scientist, a support scientist for Lockheed Martin's Human Research Facility. So I was someone who was coordinating life science experiments that were being done with the astronauts as the subjects on the space shuttle back then, and then also on the space station. And this was in the beginning of the Nemo missions. As you mentioned, it was the fourth mission. And the life sciences directorate that I worked for decided, hey, maybe we could also use this analog as a life science analog for our experiments and for that kind of thing. Why don't we send a representative down as a life science person to assess that and see if it makes sense for the future? So they actually had an application process, and I heard about this and I thought, wow, would be such a cool opportunity. I have my scuba diving certification, but I didn't have a ton of dives at that point, and you had to have a certain number of dives to apply. So I actually took vacation from my job. I booked a dive trip through one of the local dive shops to go down to Bonaire and to do 10 days straight of diving and just cram as many dives in as I could so I could come back and apply. So I did that. I came back, I applied, and I was fortunate enough to be selected. Our mission was supposed to be 10 days, but our mission was in September of 2002, so right in the middle of hurricane season. And we went down there for a few weeks for some intense training before, since of course it's saturation diving and you need to be very well trained and prepared to dive in that environment to make sure that we're safe. And our mission ended up being delayed because of tropical storms and hurricanes in the area. And then we finally got in. We were so excited to finally be in saturation. And it was supposed to be that 10 days. And in the end, it was, as you mentioned, only 5 because they had to pull us out with another tropical storm that was coming through. So didn't get the full mission in, but it was still an incredible experience. And it's just such an amazing opportunity to be living kind of on the reverse side of an aquarium. You know, look out the window at dinner time and see these fish going by, and to be doing these scuba excursions and doing different tests and performing different experiments. It was a great introduction for me what this future world might be like as an astronaut. Of course, back then I dreamed of becoming an astronaut, but I didn't think it would ever happen. So pretty fortunate to have had it come all the way through in the end.
Besides those 5 days that you lived underwater in Aquarius and your first Antarctic dive, like you talked about a little bit ago, whether it's a training dive you've been on for one thing or another, or a research dive, or maybe just a fun dive, I ask each of our guests this question: what is one of your most memorable dive stories?
There are definitely a few in this realm, but I think that one that comes to mind is one of my dives with Paul Punganis, my PhD advisor at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And this was in support of our research, my PhD research, looking at the diving physiology of emperor penguins. And we were diving, some for observation, and then also to clean the ice off of the observation tube, which was this incredible structure that had existed, I think, since the 60s in the Antarctic, where they would drill a hole in the ice, just like they do for our normal dive holes. And then they would lower this structure down, and it was this tube that you could shimmy down. And then once you got a few feet underneath the water, it was this big observation area, so windows all the way around. So you could just go and sit there staying dry, and you would be underneath the ice. You could watch the penguins dive all around, see everything else that was coming by in the water column. So that was one of our best viewing points. I mean, I could have stayed in there for hours and hours and hours on end. It was just truly magical. But ice would accumulate on those windows. So we would actually have to go in our scuba gear, we would take some ice scrapers and scrape off the outside of those windows to keep those clear. But one of those dives, the Weddell seals are very common in that area, McMurdo Sound. And Weddell seals are very unique in that they are the one species that can travel very, very extensively underneath the ice because they can hold their breath for so long. A lot of other species of seals, like the leopard seals, for example, they're really found only toward the ice edge. They don't travel extensively underneath the ice sheet. But the Weddell seals will, and they're very territorial about their breathing holes because, of course, if you're traveling extensively underneath the ice, you need to make sure eventually you can come out to breathe. So there was one day when Paul and I were going to do a dive, and a lot of times when you're getting ready to go for a dive, the Weddell seal will pop up in that hole, and you'll be, gearing up, you'll be putting your fins on right with the face of this big Weddell seal breathing beneath you and kind of waiting for that seal to leave before you can get in the hole because they take up the entire volume of that hole. So we were getting ready, the seal was nearby, and then the seal was gone. So I went in down through the hole, I went in first, and then I was going to wait for Paul, my advisor, to come in behind me. So I went down just to the bottom of the hole, and I was just hanging out there. As soon as I came down, that Weddell seal was still there. Now, usually, like other seals, once you come down, they'll leave. But this seal just stayed there. And so it was just me and this seal. And these seals are hundreds of pounds. This seal was probably 800 pounds or so. And he's next to me, just kind of checking me out. And I'm just looking at him, he's just looking at me, and I'm thinking, wow, even if he just decided to be playful and, whacked me, like, I'm dependent on this life support equipment. He certainly isn't. So you're kind of thinking about that. But it was just so incredible to have that vantage point and to observe that seal from such a close distance. And he was just waiting there. And so I was like thinking, oh, wow, is he going to stick around? Paul's coming down. Paul's got a camera. And so Paul came down through the ice, and I'm pointing, and I'm like, look, the seal's right here. And he was shocked as well, because normally they won't really stay and hang out that long. So he stayed for a bit longer, and Paul was getting his camera ready. And I almost felt as if I could just put my arm around this seal, like we were posing for a picture together. And Paul was trying to get a picture. In the end, we didn't get a picture of it, unfortunately, because the flash didn't work on Paul's camera. But it was such a great moment for our memories. It was several minutes that the seal just stayed there, and we were kind of just the three of us. And it was just such a moment of appreciating nature and wildlife, and particularly for us as dive physiology researchers, to have that moment, that shared moment with this seal. We were down there studying penguins, but Paul and all of our collaborators have also worked extensively with Weddell seals. So it just seemed like such a cool moment for us, and definitely one that I'll never forget.
Okay, ocean lovers, it's time for the dive log, the part of the show where we feature an epic dive story from one of our amazing listeners. This episode's listener dive story comes from Chelsea Hughes, a PADI instructor based in Qatar, about an unforgettable dive that she had on the Great Barrier Reef. Let's dive in.
One dive that always resonates with me was a trip that we took when I was about 13 with the family to the Great Barrier Reef. And we dropped into this one dive site, and it was freezing cold. And we were drifting between these two huge coral walls. Now, my father and I were facing each other at the time, and we just started to levitate above this gigantic rock. And as we were drifting, this rock lifted up, and it was the hugest turtle I've ever seen. And we finished the dive just drifting, my father and I facing each other with this turtle in between us the whole way through these reef walls, and it was unbelievable. And it's just always stuck in my memory as one of my favorite dives now, being 30 years old.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, for sharing about this magical dive you had with your dad as a young girl. I would say that drifting along with a massive sea turtle definitely makes for an unforgettable dive. Listeners, if you have an epic dive story to share too, head to padi.com/podcast to record and submit your most memorable dive story for a chance to be featured in an upcoming episode. We love hearing from our global community of PADI divers, so head to padi.com/podcast today. And now, back to this episode. So, Jessica, shifting gears here a bit, one of the activities that astronauts like yourself extensively train for is spacewalks. So I want to talk a bit about spacewalks. A lot of this training takes place in NASA's Neutral Buoyancy Lab, which in simple terms is essentially a massive pool. It's more complicated than that, but it's a massive pool. And so with that training, all that training for spacewalks in the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, during your mission aboard the International Space Station from September 2019 to April 2020, as you know, you did 3 spacewalks, and one of those spacewalks happened to be the first all-female spacewalk in history with your fellow astronaut, Christina Cook. And this spacewalk was hugely celebrated around the world and, a source of major inspiration for so many. So having successfully completed those historic spacewalks, also having done all those training dives in the Neutral Buoyancy Lab beforehand, and then also being an accomplished scuba diver like we've talked about, from your direct experiences, all these years of all this training, what would you say are the main similarities and differences between scuba diving and spacewalks?
Yeah, I think there are some definite similarities. Some of those we've keyed into already. And I think the first one, especially when you're talking about real technical diving, is that trust and the safety protocols in place and the trust that you have in your training and in your equipment and hardware. That's something that is very similar between the way that we do things underwater for scientific and technical diving and in space. You have to rely on that training and you have to trust the equipment, and of course make sure that you're taking very good care of your equipment and it's inspected regularly. You know, all of these things are incredibly important. And in the neutral buoyancy lab in the NBL, you do notice some really big differences between spaceflight and the underwater environment. And of course, the number one difference is gravity. You know, the reason why we train in the spacesuit underwater is because it's kind of the closest approximation we can get to what it's like to be weightless. And so to accomplish that in the spacesuit, you weigh over 400 pounds in the spacesuit. So you can't just walk around on Earth, with the spacesuit on. And you need to have hours and hours and hours of training in that spacesuit just to have that kind of muscle memory of every action that we do, because it is so important. And both environments, it is very challenging and very difficult to use a spacesuit, but there are big differences on the things that are hard and the things that are easy. And the big thing is just having that water around you. You are much more stable in the pool because of the water all around you than you would be in space. You know, in space, of course, just like everywhere else, for every action, there must be an equal and opposite reaction to stop that action, that momentum that was imparted. And you really notice that in space. And I was very surprised. Of course, I knew in my mind that it would be that different, and I knew what it would be like in space, and that you really needed to do everything you could to enhance your stability. So use different types of tools and aids that we have to give you more stability. But you really are, at the beginning of my first spacewalk, I felt like, wow, this is like I'm at the rodeo over here. You know, you put one little bit of force in, and then suddenly, you're moving all the way around. And so in the pool, that doesn't happen as much because of the drag and the viscosity of the water around you. So it keeps you more stable. Another thing is just what it's like to move. So when you're moving in the pool, because of that water, the drag and the viscosity of the water around you, it's harder to get started, but it's easier to stop if you're just moving from one place to the next. In space, that's the opposite. It's really easy to start moving, but it's harder to stop once you already have that momentum. So all of these things, you need to keep, after having hours and hours and hours of training in the pool. I'm just so used to how the pool feels, and now suddenly I'm in space and I need to remember how I need to do things differently to compensate for those differences. So it's really interesting. But I think, the biggest similarities, just to get back to summarize up that question, are the fact that you need a life support system in order to survive in that environment, whether it's underwater, whether it's in space. And that support system involves some complex breathing apparatus and CO2 scrubbing and providing oxygen. And you have to have those hours of training, and you have to trust in your training, rely on it, have it kick in, just like that muscle memory you need in any kind of emergency situation. And then also just be trusting in that equipment with some very stringent safety protocols, all very similar to the technical diving and the spaceflight world.
Yeah, wow. So it definitely sounds like there's a lot of differences. Like it's kind of similar and different equally at the same time, if that makes any sense.
Right.
But I do like to imagine that, and I think, maybe our listeners at home can imagine that scuba diving is a little bit similar to, being in a spacesuit in space, also different, but maybe a little bit similar.
Yeah, and I think it actually does key in. I think that's one of the reasons why I love scuba diving so much. Part of it, I think, is just because, when you're scuba diving, you kind of have one of your senses dulled or removed a bit. And of course, that's sound. And that makes it seem to me like this more alien environment when you're underwater. And to me, it makes me really peaceful. I feel relaxed and peaceful. It's just this added element of quiet and serenity when I'm diving underneath anywhere in the ocean. And that's the same kind of thing with space. There's no sound in the vacuum of space other than what's coming through your pressurized suit and helmet. And so you have that kind of connection of just being alone out there in your own little mini spacecraft and with your own little life support system, just like if you're scuba diving. And I don't know, that's just always appealed to my sense of happiness and content and peacefulness. I'm not sure what exactly it is, but there's definitely a similarity that I feel there with the underwater environment and then also in space.
Wow. Yeah, that's so beautifully said. I think everyone can relate to that to a certain extent. Not the space part, but the feeling that peace underwater. So it's amazing to hear that even in the vacuum of space, you can feel peace. Now, as a scientist and a history-making NASA astronaut, like I mentioned, with your first female spacewalk, before you went to space, during your time in space, and also now that you've returned to Earth, you do quite a lot of public speaking, interviews like this one, and school visits with kids. I'm curious, why is public outreach important to you, and what sort of responsibility personally do you feel in being a role model to so many people around the world?
I feel an enormous responsibility to give back and to do this kind of outreach and education. I think it's so important to what we do. And I felt that way as a scientist as well. Especially for the work that I was doing, it was all federally funded from National Science Foundation in my case. But this is taxpayer money. And so to me, if we're not able to justify what we're doing, whether that's the scientific research I was doing in my previous career or exploration as an astronaut now, if we can't justify or just really explain the importance of what we're doing to the general public, to kids, then I feel like we shouldn't be doing it, because we need to be able to relay that. Of course, there are so many reasons, but we need to make sure that everybody understands that. And that is one of our main mission objectives at NASA. We do have a mandate, education and outreach are a formal part of our job. So I do take that very seriously. And I also feel I've been quite fortunate in terms of the things that I've done, where as a scientist, I was working with charismatic megafauna, these penguins and seals and bar-headed geese. And so very easy to relate that to kids and to the public, because you have these images of these ridiculously adorable animals in places like the Antarctic. And that helps, I think, helps me convey the importance of science and basic science and what we're doing perhaps more easily. I always felt like it was a little bit unfair, to somebody that was studying algae or microbes or something that, maybe people have a harder time connecting to. But because of that, I think I feel an even stronger sense of responsibility to do that, because I had this natural venue and just something that inclined itself so much toward relaying, reaching out to the public. And being an astronaut is, of course, the same kind of thing. For some reason, when you put on this blue flight suit, people tend to really listen to what you're saying. So I think that it is very important in terms of basic science and promoting that. And, I would say, especially in recent times, having people appreciate and understand the value of science has only become increasingly more important. Mm-hmm. And for us as divers, appreciating the ocean and really the fragility and beauty of our entire planet, and that we need to protect it for the generations to come, because it does take effort to do that if we want to keep things for those future generations.
Yeah. Wow. What an amazing perspective to have, and to be so open to share it. I personally appreciate all of the outreach that you do, obviously, including this podcast. And I think I can speak on behalf of our listeners that, they appreciate it too. So another reason that your mission to space was unlike any other was because of COVID. Now, just to be an astronaut and actually go to space is obviously an extremely unique and rare experience. But on top of that, your time in space overlapped with the start of the global COVID-19 pandemic. So what was it like for you to initially observe the pandemic from space? And then what was it like returning to really a different world amidst the pandemic?
Yeah, you're right. When we launched, it was September of 2019. So we had no idea what COVID was. Nobody really did. And it was an incredibly interesting vantage point to be witnessing that from the space station, because we are looking down at the planet. It is equally as stunning and gorgeous as it was the day before. And to think about how it looked the same to us, but how drastically it was changing for all 7.5 billion people on the planet. And to think that we, of these three humans, we were the only ones not susceptible to this at that moment. It was really strange and made it a bit surreal. And while we're up there, we, of course, can talk to our family and friends, and we do get some news, but you're not as inundated with news as you are here on the ground. And the other thing is that we're very busy up there. So nothing changed with our mission. We were still extremely busy carrying out those objectives. So we had less time to kind of focus and think about, process everything that was going on. So it was very strange when, month after month went by and things were just getting worse and worse and worse. And we're thinking, wow, what is going to happen with us getting back? And toward the end of the mission, Chris Cassidy, our NASA colleague, and 2 Russian cosmonauts came to the space station. We overlapped for only about 8 days before we left. And he actually said, you guys really need to start thinking about this. You're going back to a completely different planet. And it was, we landed really on a different planet. And as soon as the hatch opened, everybody was wearing masks. And that was really our first introduction to seeing that. And we hadn't even seen other humans for 7 months. So it was very strange. And NASA and all of the international space agencies had to go to great efforts, even just to come pick us up. The other big change that we had was that we were in quarantine for a full week after coming back. One of the hallmarks of spaceflight is a dysregulation of the immune system. What they did was keep us in quarantine for a full week because basically we were potentially immunocompromised. So of course they didn't want us to risk coming into contact with a virus. So we stayed in quarantine for a full week at NASA, where normally we would have been able to go home right after that first day. So a lot of differences. And it's certainly, just like everybody else here on Earth, it has taken quite a bit of effort to really adapt to this and just kind of make it the new norm.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, like you said, everyone on Earth it's been a very different time that we've been living in. And you in particular have had such a unique experience with the pandemic. So thank you for sharing with us about that. Now, with everything we've been talking about and many things that we're, definitely not going to be able to get to, you've had an incredible life and career. But you're obviously an explorer in pretty much every sense of the word. You've focused on exploring and studying a variety of environments from inner space, aka the ocean, to outer space. And we often hear things about an unevenness between ocean exploration and space exploration and our understanding of those two realms. So, as a marine biologist and as an astronaut, what are your thoughts on the importance of continued exploration of both the ocean and of space as we look to the future?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because I've always felt quite personally involved, obviously, given my interest in both realms. And there does seem to be sometimes this kind of battle between the two where people that are passionate about ocean sciences think we're wasting so much money and NASA's budget is so big and we don't get any money, that we need to explore. And there's still so many places even on Earth that we haven't explored, particularly in the oceans. And all of those points are very valid. And I do think that we should, of course, increase science funding for all of those disciplines. But I don't think that we need to do that at the expense of NASA. I think that both should be funded and continue to be funded, and that both are very important in terms of basic science, in terms of exploration, because they're very, very different environments. Yes, we should absolutely continue to explore the oceans and get to the places where we haven't been. At the same time, the microgravity environment provides a totally different setting for the types of experiments that we can do because, as we mentioned before, the biggest difference between life underwater and in space, there's no gravity in space and there's still gravity underwater. So scientifically speaking, that opens up a whole host of different types of experiments you can do and responses you can see when you just remove this omnipresent gravitational vector that's always part of every system on the Earth. So the potential that unleashes in the scientific realm is huge. So many applications that actually help us benefit life on Earth, just like all of our research on the Earth does. So, I think to sum it up, I would say both are incredibly important. Both need to continue to be funded. And I would also argue just for the simple fact of exploration and it just being a part of our human nature to explore, to go further.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and you have such a unique perspective on that, uniquely qualified to weigh in. So Jessica, I want to wrap up with this one last thing. Most astronauts, including yourself, have said that actually getting to look at Earth from space is a truly life-changing experience, one that most of us can only imagine. Having actually had that experience, I'd love if you could share with myself and listeners your perspectives on the importance of taking care of this blue planet that we all call home.
Absolutely. Frank White wrote about this in terms of the overview effect, and it really is something that you feel and that you realize happens when you're lucky enough to look down on our planet with your own eyes from above. And it's called the overview effect in terms of how you shift and how that changes you as a person. And for me, one of the major things, also something that other astronauts have said, is that continued appreciation for how fragile and special our planet is. That's something that I've always been passionate about. So I expected, that to only continue in space. Perhaps it's a bigger change for people that haven't thought about these issues as much before they left the planet. But for me, it did definitely resonate more loudly to just realize when you're looking back and you see this thin, tenuous band of an atmosphere, and you see the most beautiful colors and ecosystems and how special this blue gem is beneath you in this void and blackness of space, and how we truly need to make sure that we do our best as humans to be responsible stewards of this special planet and home that we are so lucky to have. I think the other big feeling that I realized when I was there, when you're looking down and you see how you look down, you see the interconnected land masses and the oceans, and how it's just so easy to realize. I think it's difficult to not think about how connected we are and that we truly are all one. When you are one of 3 or 6 humans that aren't on the planet and everything else is down there in its entirety, and you don't see those man-made boundaries, those geopolitical barriers that we've imposed upon ourselves, you can understand an appreciation of how connected we are, how we have so many more commonalities than we have differences, and that we are truly one human and that we are all in this together.
Well, Jessica, on behalf of our global community of PADI divers and ocean lovers, thank you for your dedication to studying extreme environments from Antarctic waters all the way to outer space, for inspiring explorers of all ages around the world, and thank you for joining us on Dive Stories. It's been so wonderful chatting with you.
Okay, thank you, Allison. It was a pleasure to be on Dive Stories today, and keep at it. Everyone stay in the water and keep on exploring.
Thanks for tuning in to Dive Stories. You've just heard Dr. Jessica Meir, NASA astronaut and marine biologist. To learn more about Jessica's work from the sea to the stars, you can find her on social media at astro_Jessica. Looking for ideas of how to turn your passion into purpose? PADI is on a mission to unite people from around the globe to take action for the ocean, above and below the surface. Like divers holding a torch, this growing community of PADI torchbearers lights the path towards a better balance between humanity and the ocean. You can sign up right now to join this global community at padi.com/conservation. Together, our collective light shines brighter. This has been Dive Stories, brought to you by PADI. Seek adventure, save the ocean. If you love the ocean and enjoyed this podcast episode, please subscribe to Dive Stories in your podcast app and feel free to leave a review. Follow PADI on social media and head to padi.com to join our community of torchbearers working together to seek adventure and save the ocean. I'm your host, Ocean Allison. Happy diving!